Cover crops can be extremely beneficial for your soil health and your garden overall. I'm going to talk about what cover crops are, types of cover crops, how to grow them, and what to do with them. If you have never heard of cover crops before, they are crops that you grow in between seasons, and you can and should grow them for a number of reasons. While cover crops can be grown in between any season if you're not planning on growing anything in the next season, they are most commonly grown after the summer growing season for people who don't really plan on growing a fall or winter garden. In fact, if someone were planting a fall or winter garden in the same spots as their summer garden, they are technically growing cover crops. Cover crops can improve soil health and fertility, reduce soil erosion, compaction, and nutrient runoff. They can also be helpful in suppressing weeds by crowding them out. They can create biodiversity and attract pollinators, increase crop yields, break up cycles of pest and disease, and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and so much more. If you're like me and have to grow the same things in the same spot each year, like tomatoes, chances are that soil is going to be depleted of nutrients. In the case of tomatoes, that would likely be nitrogen. That's why people practice crop rotation, because growing things in a different spot each year can replenish the soil. But in my case, I have a smaller growing area, so tomatoes only do really well in one spot of my garden. And if you are taking a break for a season and not growing anything in the fall or winter or early spring, that soil would otherwise be left bare without a cover crop. So I rely on cover crops to help add nutrients and biodiversity to my soil. And if you're growing the same things in the same spots, disease can linger in the soil, and so can any overwintering pests that may attack certain plants. But if you switch up where you plant things or you do a cover crop, diseases that affect one plant but not another will die off instead of spreading, and insects that like a certain plant have no reason to stay there if they don't like what's growing next. So you're really trying to break the cycle. It's not perfect. It doesn't mean if you do crop rotation or use cover crops that your issues with disease and pests will be solved, but it can definitely help reduce those issues. And if you are growing something each season, switching out summer crops for fall and winter crops, then chances are those crops will act as a cover crop, because most people go from growing things like peppers, cucumbers, and tomatoes to things like kale, broccoli, and other leafy greens. And the brassica family is a really common type of cover crop, so if you are growing these types of things after your summer garden, congratulations, you're technically cover cropping. Besides brassicas, there are so many different kinds of cover crops. Common types are hairy vetch, legumes, ryegrass, oats, clover, buckwheat, sorghum, alfalfa, and triticale. And all of these different types of cover crops can tackle certain issues better than others, or be a better choice than others, depending on what you've grown and what you're going to grow next. But of course, you can mix and match your cover crops too. Many seed companies will sell a cover crop mix, but definitely do your research and see what your soil may need to be replenished with after a certain crop before growing your next crop. For me, where I have to grow my tomatoes in the same beds each year, I know I need to grow something heavy with nitrogen, so something in the legume family like peas would be great at adding more nitrogen to the soil by the spring when I plant tomatoes again. Because my summer garden is still going strong, I'm not ready to start any cover crops right now, but it's really easy to grow them, and I'll demonstrate on this bare patch of ground. So I have some black mustard seeds, and I actually bought this shaker of them for about $7 at the grocery store. These are often used in a lot of different cuisines, so it ended up being cheaper for me to buy them from a store. I like to water the soil, then just toss the seeds onto the soil and water them in, and keep the area watered until I see them sprout. So you don't need to worry about individually planting thousands of seeds for your cover crops. Just toss them onto the soil and water them, and in a few days, you'll see some sprouts. However, if you are growing cover crops or your fall and winter garden acts as a cover crop, typically you'll want to make sure that you chop them down before they bolt or go to seed. And the technical term for this is terminating your cover crops. And besides them going to seed, there are a few factors to consider for when the best time to terminate your cover crops would be. Terminating them right before they flower or right after they have is a good idea, because they can be harder to manage if they've gone to seed, because you may end up with some seeds in the ground that will sprout when you're trying to prep your beds for what you're going to plant next, which can be frustrating. This borage here is not a cover crop, although some people do use borage as a cover crop, but I can use it to demonstrate. With cover crops, you want to chop and drop, meaning you cut them down and mix them into the soil to decompose, and that's what will help add more nutrients to your soil.
but they need time to actually decompose first to be incorporated into the soil. And this is pretty much what the term green manure refers to. So you should terminate your cover crops generally 2 to 4 weeks before you plant out, and of course you can add other amendments to the soil like fresh compost or worm castings as well. And when you're chopping and dropping, you don't need to pull the roots out. You can leave those in to decompose as well. But some things might start to grow back, so you can try to cut them a little bit more than below the base of the soil.
I know this was a lot of information, and there's probably even more that I could have said about cover crops, but hopefully this was a good introduction to cover crops if you've never heard of them before.